And in my time working for the president as his White House press secretary, I saw firsthand just how he thinks about his role and how he thinks about Republicans. And as he looks ahead to 2024, he's reaching back to the success of his 2020 bid and the messaging around that, campaigning against Trumpism without totally alienating all Republicans. The idea in part is for the president to convince people who may not be Democrats to come over and support him, too, if they can't stomach Trump. And it's not just politics. That's also who he is. When I worked for him, he would regularly pick up the phone and call Republicans without much fanfare, without announcing it. He's kind of a bridge builder by nature. The open question is if that strategy will pay off in 2024. My next guests are people who I've spent a lot of time with in their offices, on the phone, texting them about strategy. So I'm so grateful for them for being here tonight. Kate Bedingfield is the former White House communications director under President Biden. We worked very closely together. Robert Gibbs served as the White House press secretary for President Obama, also worked very closely with him. I want to start just with this overarching question, Kate, for you, because you worked for the president for so long. You know him very well. I think his overarching view is that there's a real appetite out there in the country for someone who can find common ground, even with members of the modern day Republican Party. That promise was, of course, a big pitch in 2020. How central, Kate, do you think that is going to be to the reelection campaign and the messaging of that as we look to 2024?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me, Jen. This is a treat. But yes, I think that's going to be a critical piece of the messaging in 2024 because for two reasons. One, because as you said, it is fundamentally what President Biden believes. It is how he has long navigated Washington, frankly, successfully. And he fundamentally believes that leaders should be able to find common cause when they can. And I think, secondly, it will be a huge piece of the messaging because we should do away with this notion that it's an either-or dichotomy, that you either have to fire up the base or you can reach out across the aisle. Remember, Democratic voters are people who also want to see progress. They want to see things get done. And so what President Biden's been able to do in the first few years of his presidency is notch wins where Republicans wouldn't come along, things that, he couldn't get them to do. He went and did them himself. The Inflation Reduction Act, the biggest investment in tackling climate change in a generation. He did that without Republican votes. But he was able to get Republican votes for a gun safety bill, able to get meaningful things done with Republicans. And for him, that's fundamental. And I think that is what voters want to see. And you can bet that that will be a central piece of his pitch for 2024.
So, obviously it's going to be a part of his pitch. Kate just confirmed that for us. Gibbs, you've done a lot of campaigns. You didn't work on the Biden campaign. But in this age of Trump, do you think that message in this environment is going to work if it's central to the president's reelection campaign?
I think it won't only work. I think it's what the American people yearn for. And I don't think it's a glowy, romanticized version of it. Mm-hmm. They just know that in an argument where two people are having that argument, that the likely answer lies somewhere in the middle. And I totally agree with Kate. I think people come to Washington to get things done, whether you're the most junior member of Congress or the most senior member of the Senate or the President of the United States. You want to see progress on things. And the American people are sophisticated enough to know that the only way they're going to see progress is if both sides work together. And they spent 4 years watching somebody foment division, sometimes and almost always unnecessarily. Biden pitched himself as the competent grown-up in the room that would wipe away the chaos and could bring Washington together. I love the line he's been using, and I'm sure it's been using it for a while, that he's, I was told this bipartisanship was dead. I think that is a great way to pitch it. I think his accomplishments show it, and I have no doubt we're going to hear a lot about it over the course of the next 2 years.
So one of the big elephants in the room here, see what I did there, is all of these legal woes and troubles for Trump. I mean, he's already been indicted. He could be indicted in a federal court soon. The president has not spoken about it. He is an observer of the tradition that you should not comment on an ongoing investigation. Do you think, Kate, that continues to be the strategy moving forward as these cases become not about hush money to an adult film star, but about democracy and about national security and rule of law?
Well, I think President Biden has never hesitated to call Donald Trump out for the threat that he believes that he poses to democracy. So, I would say that there's no question that President Biden is he's never going to shy away from calling out what he sees as a really, frankly, an existential threat to our country. However, he's also going to continue to focus on what he's gotten done on the case that he has made for bringing back manufacturing jobs, for bringing semiconductor chips back to this country, making sure we're having our supply chains here in the United States. We're not dependent on countries overseas. He's doing things that are making a difference for the economy. He's doing things that are tackling, as I said earlier, our climate crisis, the gun crisis. He's fighting to protect our rights. He's fighting to protect the right of women to have access to abortion, to reproductive health. So I think what you're going to see, I would imagine what you will see from the president is you will continue to see him make the case for the things he's done, the promises he's kept, frankly, from the 2020 campaign. But you will also see him never shy away from calling out the threat that he believes that Trump and MAGAism pose to this country.
I ask this because I think it's a really tricky balance, right? And most candidates don't have to run against Trump. So, Gibbs, what do you think about whether the president should weigh in more on the broad messaging of these cases or these cases in general?
I think the tack he's taken so far, I think, is the right one. Look, Donald Trump guarantees every day that the news about Donald Trump is going to get hefty placement in our news diet. There's not really anything that the president needs to do to push that case forward. I think it's also going to be interesting to watch when or if the Republicans running against Trump begin to try to shout out a difference between him and an indictment, whether it's in New York or whether it could be coming indictments. I think the president is best suited, as Kate described, to make the case that really works so well in 2022, which is, are you in the mainstream or are you in the extreme? And I think what Donald Trump, what Republicans are, whether it's on guns, whether it's on abortion, whether it's on healthcare costs, I think they're a party that seems to be a step outside of the mainstream, particularly when it comes to swing voters. That's the contrast I think he draws the most blood from. I think it's the one he's best suited given his political leanings for the course of his career. I think those are the contrasts that you'll see him make the most.
So, Kate, I'm a believer that the president is often underestimated. I know you are, too, from talking to you about it. There is one thing a lot of people are freaking out about in the Democratic Party, and that is enthusiasm among young people, among progressives. What is your take, or what would you tell them so that they don't freak out about where this is headed and how the president is going to work to win those votes?
Well, first of all, it feels like sometimes there's a cottage industry in professional Democratic circles of, one, both underestimating Joe Biden, but also wringing your hands and panicking and frantic. If we spent as much energy tackling the problems as we did, telling reporters we were worried, the narratives might be very different. But look, I think ultimately what the president is going to do is going to continue to focus on the case he's made. And I think it's important to remember elections don't happen in a vacuum. Elections are about choice and about contrast. And, the president frequently says, don't compare me to the almighty, compare me to the alternative. And so as the campaign goes on and you continue to see this contrast between the extremism of Trump and the MAGA Republicans and this progress that Joe Biden's offering, I think people will, at the end of the day, they're going to pull that lever for Joe Biden.
Kate Bedingfield and Robert Gibbs, two of the smartest people I know in Democratic politics and communications. Thank you so much for joining me tonight.